Brian O'Connell is past president of the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland. And as president, he represented Ireland as a founder member of the Architects' Council of Europe, the representative body of the profession in the EU. He's an architect in practice in Ireland on major public and private projects. Among those that caught my eye is the survey work that he did on upper areas of O'Connell Street. This is just a personal interest. Dublin's main thoroughfare and traditional setting for protest and ceremony and commerce in Dublin. It was part of their heritage strategy to inform further development of Upper O'Connell while respecting its historical character. His thesis on conserving the Parliament buildings of Ireland no doubt supported his recent work as advisor to the Commissioners of Public Works on the current conservation at the seat of the Irish Parliament at Leinster House in Dublin. He's currently engaged on a project for a full historical recreation of the White House as James Hoban would have known it, and this structure is to be located in Tipperary as an active monument to Hoban in his homeland. We're very happy to have Brian come from Dublin to visit us today to be our featured speaker. He will bring his design eye, his background in law, and his deep historical knowledge to discuss his topic today, which is the cultural trace of representative government as endured in its buildings. Please welcome Brian O'Connell.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and I'm delighted to be here. I must say I find myself here very much with William Seal and Pam Scott and others in a pantheon in which I'm very much a commoner. And so I come to this with a due and appropriate humility on the basis that nearly everything that I know in relation to the United States buildings comes from them. And therefore I can only look at it perhaps with the eye of an outsider. And I was particularly taken this morning with what Pam had said when she quoted from Emerson, a quotation I hadn't heard before, to say that Europe extends to the Allegheny. Now, I think that's exactly what my thesis is. That in fact, what you find in the United States at the foundation, in the foundation of the Republic, you find in fact what is a transposed European idea and a transposed European culture. And that it is the impact of that culture that I want to turn to. With regard to, let's say, the Capitol as we now find it, or the White House as we now find it, the Executive Mansion as it is, to a certain extent, these are the evidence, these are the outcome, these are the conclusions, these are the facts. The question is, what created them? Where did they come from? And how far can you track them back into their genetic origins? And to a large extent, that is what my interest is. My interest is, what are the underlying influences, the confluences that came together to create these particular outcomes rather than any other? And that Bryce, who was, I suppose, one of the great English commentators on the American Commonwealth in the 19th century, he perceived the United States at its foundation as being 13 states, which my analogy for it is they are like 13 owners of 13 terraced houses, and that there is now going to be, there are invading circumstances that are closing in on them. They are neighbours and they don't want to be anything else. They want to continue to be neighbours. They are independent, they live within their own cocoon, but by the same token they come together in common interest, in the interest of common protection. And that when the Stamp Act comes in 1865, this is pretty much the last resort. This is the encroachment of the unacceptable developer on their territory. And they merge together and the Stamp Congress takes place. And that because of the pressure that's brought to bear, the British Parliament backs down. But what it does then in response is, in 1766, it brings in the Declaration Act of 1766, in which it declares that it has the right to legislate for the colonies. That, of course, is the turning point and the tinderbox which triggers off what eventually becomes a long and a slow ignition of a revolution which ends with the sword, it ends with the cutting of the relationship, it was an unsustainable relationship, and it ends by cutting off, so to speak, the mother country and creating independence. Now, it's at that time, according to Bryce, that the states come together, 13 states come together. They come together reluctantly, because in fact they are now looking around them and they're eyeing colonial powers. You have Spain and Louisiana. It has gone back to Spain. It transfers between France and Spain, but it's then Spanish Louisiana. You have the French and the English. You have in Canada. They've pushed them back as far as the borders. You have the seas are still rife with potential colonialists, and that as a result of that, or imperialists, I should say, that as a result of that, you have this idea that the states have to unite in some way, but they still don't want to become a single apartment building. They still want to be a terrace of 13 houses. And so you eventually slowly get the growth, you get tension in the centre, where you have a couple of people who actually turn out to be geniuses. But they're geniuses bred in the culture, European culture. And you have people like Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and so forth. They all come from the European culture. They're extraordinary people. And you get these circumstances which Kierkegaard talks about it from time to time. There are many Mozarts who have potentially been born, but they were born into the wrong time. Now you get the right people born into the right time, and then you get the result. So now we have these people come together, but what they're working with is a weak association. That's the point I really want to make that Bryce is saying. It's a weak association. They don't really want to be anything more than neighbours, but they've got to find some way of associating with each other in order to protect themselves against the predators that are the wolves that are continually circling around the outer edges, whom of course they have learnt now with good reason not to trust. So in order to do that, they then set up the Continental Congresses, and you have on the other side, and the reason I'm making this point is that you have on the other side people who have come from the classical tradition, people like Jefferson and Washington. Washington perhaps being the older statesman, Jefferson being slightly more the young buck in relation to classicism and so forth. They come together, but they're both learned, well-educated gentlemen from, if you like, old European stock or old European traditions, and that they want to make this succeed. They have to find a way of making it succeed. So of course, what Jefferson perceives then, having been trained in the classics himself, he perceives that this must be the third great republic. The last thing they want is aristocracy. What they now want is to get back to Cicero's fundamental idea of a democracy. That in fact you have, it's Aristotle's originally, that in fact every man is born to be a citizen, and that in order to create a stable state you must have a separation of powers. That's Cicero. So that in fact you must separate the legislature from the executive from the legislature from the judiciary, and that they must interact between as an interlocking triangle, and that is something they must maintain. Montesquieu then sees this in the British Constitution, and perhaps he was right. It is not by any means a perfect example of it, but the underlying principles of it are there. So you can convert what is a theoretical monarchy, but in reality a democracy, into a pure democracy. So he creates this idea that there have been two, this is Jefferson, there have been two great republics in the past. There has been Athens, the Greek Republic, there has been Rome, the Roman Republic, and now there will be the third great republic in the evolution of republicanism, which he will perceive to be, if you like, the evolution of mankind towards the overall idea of Aristotle's principle that every man is born to be a citizen, that America will be the third great republic. But the problem is he's working from a very weak base. He has the 13 states who are not really into this. They just want to be left alone to get on with it. And that he now must, so to speak, create something that will draw them together. He must create a central focus. And so what does he do? He brings together what are already there, the cultural basis of the Constitution. This has already been developing in Europe. It's not visible. It's difficult to see it in its growth form, but it's easy to see it in inverse. By looking back on it, you can see it. It's difficult to see it looking forward. But this has been growing. Ideas of constitutional, or at least constitutional independence, the idea of a democratic republic has been growing inside English-speaking Europe and inside French-speaking Europe. These have been growing together. They've been growing from different models. One is coming from a common law model, the other is coming from a Roman law model. But they're approaching the same thing. This idea that the people themselves do have ultimately the right to govern themselves. And this is the idea of government with the consent of the governed. Now, this is a perfect time. He's born into the perfect time. All of this thought is developing in France. In this, the Enlightenment in France is bringing all of this thought together, so that he's just fitting right, slotting into the right time. Jefferson goes to France. He is very much influenced by France. Franklin goes to France, and then in fact Franklin comes to Ireland. He's actually very impressed with the development side of it. He can see the positive in it, rather than just seeing what ultimately, what ultimately expresses itself, which is the negative side. So this is largely what I want to address here, is look back closer to the roots. Don't look above the ground of what came out in the form of the American institution of Washington, but look underneath it and see what were those influences that were already operational that in fact created that. And this is why I find it particularly almost inspiring that what Pam Scott had picked up there in terms of Emerson's observation that Europe extends to the Allegheny, because it did. It eventually became America. America lay beyond it. And then America flowed back to the East Coast and absorbed Europe. So America becomes a kind of a flux and a reflux in terms of both its constitutional and, I think, its architectural expression. So having said that, I suppose the first thing, I have nothing there. That's merely an indication, I suppose. It's Cicero addressing a parliament. In many ways, modern constitutional ideas begin with Cicero. They're picked up and perfected both in England and in France in the 18th century, but that they begin much earlier. And that in this we have the idea of parliament. And here we have the concept of the Roman parliament, the Roman Senate. And that the word parliament, they use the word senate, and the word senate comes from the word senatus, meaning an old man, because in fact they place trust in age. The word presbyter in Greek is the same thing, so Presbyterian are the old men. The senators in Latin are the old men. So that in fact we have the idea of the senators here coming together, and parliament is a Norman French word that we use, which is the word to speak. They discuss, so that they come together to discuss. And that this comes back to, Newman is probably one of the greatest intellects of the 19th century, and that Newman observes that we as human beings do not know the truth instinctively. We in fact have to find it out, and we find it out by trial and error. We work towards finding the truth. And that the way that we find the truth is we talk to one another, we observe, and we deduce. We use logic, we use reason, and we use instinct, we use our intuition. We bring all these together in order to determine what way we go, and out of that come our decisions. So that in fact what we have here is we have the process of parliament, the process of talking. Before I go on to touch on what I want to touch on, I want to just try and explain a concept which, again, we use it in conservation, architectural conservation, and that perhaps it's worth commenting on. Henry Bergson was a French philosopher, and he was appointed by Woodrow Wilson. Wilson appointed Bergson as to the European Monuments Commission in the League of Nations. Now, Wilson had a vision. Wilson thought that, in fact, you could reunite Europe. The United States had managed to unite itself. You could also unite Europe. And the point at which you ought to start trying to unite it was at its cultural base, because all of the European countries were closely interrelated. They had the same culture, they derived from the same Greco-Roman sources, and that in fact they had subsequently divided. And that they had expressed themselves in their monuments and in their art, and in the art of architecture. They had expressed themselves as a common people, as a people as one entity, and that Wilson then, seeing this, appointed Bergson as the chairman of that commission. That commission exists today. It's now become ICOMOS if you track it through. It is now currently the institution that sets in world standards for monuments and preservation of World Heritage Sites. It's the same, ultimately the same organisation that tracks its way through. And that Bergson had in his philosophy, he had this concept of la durée, or le temps duré, and that this was an idea about time. Bergson was a philosopher, but Bergson had this idea of time, that time is not in fact linear. It is not simply a question of the Earth travelling around the Sun and the Earth rotating. That's not time. Time, in fact, is a series of events and experiences, and that like the sediments that are laid down in the growing of a rock, where a rock is built up by sediments, that the same thing happens in time, and that every event that occurs was only a possibility until it happened. But when it happened, it was an absolute. So anything could have happened up to the point when it does, and after it does, nothing else could have happened. So that in fact you now start defining time, and that he had this idea that time becomes endured in human experience, and that this applies not only to buildings, but it applies to people, it applies to us, it applies to our background, to our race. We are all, if you like, generated by circumstances, and those circumstances continually make us. So I don't know if you've ever seen any of these little three-dimensional plastic models that you can build a three-dimensional building in a plastic model with a computer. And at first it means nothing. You just see a whole lot of blobs going all over the place, and bit by bit, as it goes round, it keeps layering, and eventually you begin to see the building emerging. Well, Bergson is saying that la durée is in fact us emerging from this process, and that each culture builds its own shape, its own genetic material, so to speak, is built into it on the one side, and circumstances are built in on the other. And that these are two great forces. Circumstances are endless possibilities until they happen. They're a series of interactive causes and effects, which once they lock into time, into measured time, then they become sediment in terms of building us up into what we are. So this idea of endurance, and this is again, I come back to this, why I'm saying I think it was so important from my point of view, this observation that Europe extends to the Allegheny, that in fact it was this washing over from Europe, what all Europe had already endured, what the people, the cultures that were brought here, when architects were brought, when lawyers were brought, they already were built in, they were already inlayered with this European experience that tracked its way at least back to the separation of the tribes when Greece and Rome and the other developments of Europe in the earliest stages of the development of the European peoples, that when this occurred, when they broke away from the Eastern, when they broke away from the Persians. So that I give the other two as an example here as to why do we have Truman and why do we have Lincoln. And I just want to cite here an example of this, and I go back to Robert Clara's excellent book, The Hidden White House, which is, again, I think it's an extraordinary journey through the recreation of the White House and through all of these ideas and how they become modified and distorted in the process. But in that, Robert records one incident where, in fact, Truman had ordered, first of all, that the works be done, the whole interior of the White House be taken out, and that the early intention was that it would be, in proper conservation terms, carefully conserved and put back again. But the more pressure there was on time to get the job finished so he could actually complete his presidency by leaving from it, the less important this became. And the more it was, get it done, it doesn't matter how. Well, the how was, to a large extent, that a lot of the material that should have been recycled and brought back was disposed of and wasn't returned. So that in fact we tend to get a faux interior to the White House now, faux up for its time. It since has acquired, if you like, an authenticity of its own, but that at the time it was replaced, it was a false replacement. And that this particular false replacement had the impact on people, and that Robert records one incident where you had a black worker who was instructed to remove the floors, the upper floor, and that he was to dispose of it, he was to dump it or to destroy it. And he was discovered that he was carefully putting it to one side and wrapping it up and containing it. And when asked as to why he was doing that, he said, because President Lincoln walked on that floor, he said, I'm not throwing that floor out. Now what he was talking about was temps duré. He knew a lot more than the people who in fact were directing him from the top down. He had a true sense of it, that in fact this floor had acquired a certain quality by reference to the fact that Lincoln had walked on that floor, and that of course Lincoln, that tells its own story in terms of the way in which he responded to it. So to that extent, I've just incorporated those there. Now, again, what I want to touch on momentarily is the, I suppose, is the perception of the arts. Architecture is a silent language that speaks. And by that I mean it has a grammar, and it has a symbolism. It also reacts with the eye, and it is in terms of space. It is how we react to the world outside. Our first introduction to the world outside is through architecture. We can relate to it through hieroglyphics. We can read. We can understand sounds and we can interpret them. We learn to do all of these things. But one that we have that immediately responds to it is sight, and that our vision fixes us in space. So all of these things form part of a culture. A culture builds, if you like, builds a net around itself. It builds a world around itself. And that culture building a world around itself, the visual is enormously important. But the visual must talk. The visual is not dumb. And that the visual, when it speaks, will speak in a language. Now, in the earlier days of architectural development, I suppose the poor old peasant who had a day's work to do didn't give too much thought to these kind of refinements. But that as society developed and that people became, if you like, more interested in learning and became more intellectually refined and more intellectually polished, then all of this became more important to them. And that in this we have eventually got the idea that culture defines people, and that one particular group of people are superior to another depending upon their cultural status. And therefore it becomes important to express your cultural status. And here we have in this print, this Hogarth print here, we have the if you like, him summarized. Hogarth, I think you've got to remember, has always had his tongue well wedged in his cheek. He may well have been saying what he was expected of him, but whether he meant it or not, one can never be 100% sure. And I think here Hogarth is telling us, here you have George III on the top here. Again, the patron of all, in other words, the all that is good. And then below him, here you have the arts, so to speak, here in the form of the tree. And you have painting, and you have sculpture, and you have architecture. And the strongest branch is architecture. That's the one that is dominating in that. And then here you have Britannia. And here she has her spear in one hand and her watering can in the other. And I think there's no doubt a slight tongue in the cheek there with regard to that. So she's doing something useful while leaning on her spear. So she's obviously laid her shield down somewhere. That's not evident. And that what she's doing is she's taking this, the sort of the nourishing water of learning, and that she is now transposing it. For some reason or other, it hadn't been placed sufficiently close to the roots of the arts. So she is now, Britannia is now diverting that. And that you get this whole idea of the upper class, this aristocratic class within England, are somehow or other patrons of the arts. And the interesting thing that Hogarth seems to be saying here is that architecture is going to be one of the strongest. Now, this remains to be true, because to be a gentleman within this society, you had to have a working knowledge of architecture. It wasn't good enough to be good at the classics. This was the spoken language of Greece and Rome, but you also had to have, if you like, a working knowledge of the way in which visually this language was expressed, classical language was expressed. Now, you didn't have to do it. I mean, that would get your hands dirty. That wasn't required. But what you had to do was to understand it and to know it and to have an opinion on it. And that you were not a properly refined and educated gentleman unless you had an opinion on architecture. And that it's from that I think, and the reason why I'm stressing that is because I think ultimately I will offer this as a potential explanation for why a lot of the architectural relationships in respect of the capital ultimately failed, why they didn't work. Because in fact the nexus between this European flowing across of people like Jefferson and Washington, who were in fact gentlemen within the understood sense, English sense of the term, and that they would have a knowledge, and it was no inconsiderable knowledge, it was a real knowledge of the arts, but they were not architects, but they had knowledge of architecture. But they wanted their ideas implemented. They didn't want somebody to substitute those ideas for them. So there was going to be, if you take a type of amanuensis architect who was developed, who I'll come back to, and of whom a classic example, I think, would be Hoban. And then there were architects who were trained, for example, like Hallett, who was trained through the French Academy and in what would become the École des Beaux-Arts later on, in that tradition, Blondel's tradition, who in fact believed that the architect was one person, he was an artist. It was a little bit like the patron telling the portrait painter exactly what he wanted painted, not how to paint it. The answer was no, the portrait painter interpreted the subject. He wasn't directed by the subject, he interpreted it. Both systems worked, where you could have an architect per se. The modern idea is the architect is per se. In other words, it is an integral process that you go through and you deliver an outcome, an end outcome. You listen to your client and then you dispose of that and go ahead and do the job. That's what you do. That's what Hallett was doing. That didn't work at the end of the day, because Hoban came from the amanuensis side, where he was trained as what was called an artisan architect, and that when he came in, he actually knew how to address his patron. He came from a class that accepted the patron, and that what he could do is he could interpret, he could polish, he could improve, but he never actually would take, if you like, charge of creating an idea of his own. So when it comes to an idea of your own, then we move back to where did the culture for this come from? And that, of course, it came from, ultimately from Palladio in the case of England. And this is because Inigo Jones had gone to Italy. He had done the Grand Tour in Italy. Again, he was a son of a cloth maker. He was an apprentice joiner. He was picked out as having had a special talent. He was sent on the Grand Tour, and that when he came back, he was a man of very considerable ability, and that he brought back Palladio's books with him. Now, what had happened was that Palladio was a Venetian architect in the end of the 15th and early 16th century, and that what he had done was he had taken Vitruvius. Vitruvius was the original source, the only classical source that had survived on the art of architecture. Vitruvius was not known as an architect of any special standing, but he was the man that wrote the textbook. And that as a result of having written the textbook, his textbook passed on into subsequent generations. It was picked up in the Renaissance. It was picked up like people like Serlio, Palladio, Scamozzi. They picked it up, and that they then went back and they studied the ancient ruins. They came back and that they derived a series of rules from those. And those were known as the canons of architecture. And Palladio laid down canons. Now, canons were very suitable to the type of structure of the gentleman architect, because he was used to learning grammar. You could give him a Greek grammar or a Latin grammar, and you could tell him how to construct sentences. You could then give him Cicero, tell him to analyse Cicero. We all did this in school, those who were old enough to have done the classics. You went through Cicero, you read Thucydides, and that you did essays on them and you analysed them. But in fact, could you write in Greek or could you write in Latin? Absolutely not. You know, there was no way you could. But by the same token, you are now educated. You now passed the qualification of being the gentleman. So nothing better than a textbook or a primer in architecture, and that in the process they picked up and they started to explain. They started to explain what Palladio and Scamozzi and the rest of them were saying. And what they were saying boiled down to something quite simple, but nonetheless important. And I am heading towards a point here, although maybe taking a long time to get to it. But what they came down to was the idea of the orders. And that if you went back to classical, to the classical buildings and studied them, there were three orders of Greek architecture. There was the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. Now, there were two later orders, one known as the Composite and the other known as the Tuscan. We can park those ones for the moment, because the three they're going to concentrate on are the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. And that, as you can see, looking at these are given the same building and how they would, in fact, present in each order. And what you'll notice there is the building is getting higher in each case, and that in fact the columns are getting more slender as they go on, and that you then have on these. Now this is from Perrault, which isn't the exact one. There wouldn't have been these pedestals in the original classics. These would be more the Renaissance orders, but this illustrates the proportion of the orders. And then taking one in particular, Scamozzi, for example, studies the Ionic order, and that he gives what he calls the Roman version of that, which he gives the proportions of, and then he gives his own version. There is one example of this in Roman buildings, but he gives this as the preferred order, which is known as Scamozzi's Ionic. Now in that you will see that they didn't have, and it's important to remember, they didn't have a foot or a metre or anything else. There was no universal measurement. And therefore measurement had to be internal, and this was essential to the concept of architecture. Measurement had to be set by reference to one thing, and everything else was in proportion to it. So that you took the diameter of a column at its base, you divided it into 360 minutes, and that those 360 minutes were modules. They were referred to as M's, and that everything else would be related to that. It would be related to the base, the diameter and circumference of the base of the column. And that as you went through it, and if you look at all of these measurements that appear on the side of it, all of these are relating back to the proportion it is of the base of the column. So that once you decided to use an order, then there was a whole grammar that went with it, and that it was exactly the same as you would do, say, with the Latin or Greek grammar. That you would take it and it would tell you how to construct the sentence, and there was only one legitimate way of constructing the sentence, and that any departure from that would be termed mannerism. It would no longer be classically pure. Now there's one I want to stop on for a moment, and that is the Corinthian, and that we have the in Vitruvius, Corinthian has a legend. Each column has a legend as to how it came into existence. Now these legends are like Homer's Iliad. They never necessarily happened, but they sum up together an idea, and that idea becomes a symbol, and that symbol then explains a use. So that in this we have Callimachus is on his way through what amounts to being, I suppose, a cemetery, and he sees this basket here. And that this basket here has a tile on the top of it, and it has the Acanthus plant growing up around it. And that the legend behind that is that a beautiful young maiden in Corinth had died, and that she was buried there, and that her nurse went along to feed her in going into the next world. Again, this part a little bit like all primitive cultures, this idea of putting food into a grave. And the nurse leaves the basket on top of the tomb and puts a tile on the top of it, presumably to stop the birds or whatever from taking anything out of the basket. And then over time, the acanthus leaf grows up around the basket. And then Callimachus is a sculptor. He's going past this, he sees this, and he develops the Corinthian column. So here we have an idea behind it. If we go back to the other orders, and if we go back to the other orders, what we see is that each one of the orders then has got a language behind it. The Doric is the pure Greek order. That comes from the idea of Doria, which is Greece itself, and that is based on the Greek soldier, and that is the proportion of a man, and that it's supposed to be the width of his foot. He's supposed to be 6 times the height of his foot, and therefore the base is the width of his foot, and his height is 6 times. Now, he stands flat on the ground. He wears no shoes, because when a Greek soldier went into battle, he didn't wear anything. And that on that basis, that he has him down, there are no flutes on the columns or anything else, and that he is supposed to represent strength, the strength of the Greek soldier. And therefore, this Doric building, this Doric order is going to be suitable for buildings that are making a very strong statement about a strong man, something that can't be assaulted, be it a fortress, a prison, be it whatever it is, that the buildings are going to be suitable for that function. And that the interesting thing is that you will see, I think it's the Lincoln Memorial now that has got Doric columns in it. There's a message contained in that. Why is it Doric? It's Doric because it's talking about immovable strength. If we go on to Ionic, Ionic is the one that is used, in fact, in the White House. It's Scamozzi's Ionic that's used in the White House. And that the standard symbolism behind that was that the scrolls that you see around are the matron's hair. This is matron, this is the mother. and that this is her hair around here, and that you will see the fluting of the columns, they're fluted columns, and this is her dress as she comes along, and that proportion-wise, again, it's slightly greater, she's slightly slimmer, she's slimmer than the man, and therefore in proportion to her foot, she's taller. She's 7 times her foot. A man is 6 times his foot. He's wider and stockier, and his foot might be bigger. But in fact, the ratio, this is all about proportion. It's not ultimately about the height of the column. This is incidental. This depends on what width of the column you decide on. So it's all reserved to proportion. So you find then for buildings that have a motherly quality to them, essentially Parliament buildings, and buildings where in fact care is expressed, that the idea of the mother behind this is expressed. And therefore you find that this is an appropriate style, it's an appropriate order for buildings of that type. If we go on to the Corinthian is the maidenly, and that this is presenting with grandeur. This is for palaces. And this is for places of importance. This is for places which you are to revere, so to speak. Now, it's interesting, I want to just here to mention, again, before I haven't really got to where I'm going at all, but what I want to mention quickly here is a combination of things, bringing us back for a moment to what we said about Jefferson and Washington having to create a very strong response to a weak audience, so to speak, in terms of the 13 states. They must make this very strong. So Jefferson, first of all, decides to call the building that will be at the centre of this the Capitol. And Pam has picked this up, that this is something that was, of course, very much in Jefferson's idea. It was not going to be the Senate, it was going to be the Capitol, because the Capitol was the Capitoline Hill in Rome, which was the high point in Rome, where Romulus is supposed to have founded Rome and built there a temple. And that this temple was the temple of Jupiter. See, and Jupiter was the god of gods. So we're now talking about seniority. We're talking about the best spot in Rome, and we're talking about the highest god, the god over the gods. So when it came to the issue of the most important single thing, Jupiter and the Capitol were going to be 2 very important things. Now, Capitol we can take from his decision in calling it the Capitol, but why then the temple of Jupiter, and why was Ionic as opposed to, why was Corinthian as opposed to Ionic used on the Capitol? The Capitol is Corinthian. Now you could say it's because it's a place of grandeur. In a way, that doesn't altogether gel. You've got the White House has got the maternal quality to it by having the Ionic. Why has the Capitol not? If you take the Parliament House in Dublin, if you take all of the standard Parliament buildings that were in existence at the time, they're all based on the Ionic. They all have this maternal quality of minding the people. Whereas you have Corinthian, Jefferson selects Corinthian. I think the reason, and I offer you this as the reason for it, is because the Vespian, I think, had captured the Athens, and that in the process there was the Temple of Zeus in Athens, and the Temple of Zeus was based on Corinthian. It was the great Corinthian building, and Zeus was the god of gods. He was the equivalent of Jupiter, and that he had been the first great civilization and the first great republic. He had built in this style, largely giving this idea of sanctity to the highest point, rather than Parliament. In other words, it wasn't where the spirit of the people was going to be invested. It was where the god lived. And that in many ways, I think what happened was that Jefferson, knowing that in fact these had been taken, the giant capitals, Corinthian capitals, had been taken from Athens to Rome, and that they had been built in the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill in Rome, later destroyed, but that in fact this was the transfer. Corinthian was the transfer from Athens to Rome, and that in fact taking the name Capitol was the transfer to Washington, and that with it came the Corinthian order. So I think there is a symbolism in language behind all of this that remains important, and that perhaps it needs more research. But in fact, I think that if one goes back to the mindset, if we had Jefferson in this room and we spoke to him about this, I think that this would have been ordinary to him. It would be like talking to him about Latin grammar or something. It's something that he would have been part of his childhood. He would have been bred with. But in this, and then of course he uses the same idea of the sub-capitals, so to speak, throughout the rest of the states, so the states are now equally treated. So what he has now is he's going to create this great city. He's going to bring about, and in the centre of it is going to be this capital, and this capital is going to be expressed through the Corinthian order. This is going to bring the third great republic. The world's third great republic is going to be founded here. And that, of course, nobody better than L'Enfant to give him the plan of the city. We have heard about that. And that, of course, the capital was going to be the centre point of the city. It was going to communicate with in his original plan, it was going to communicate with the executive mansion. You have the Supreme Court, I think, was originally within the capital. That was going to be part. So you were going to have Cicero's separation of powers as expressed by Montesquieu. You were going to have that expressed in building form, and it was going to be expressed through the orders. It was going to be expressed through not only the classical language itself, in terms of names applied to things, but the classical language in terms of the architecture of the time. Inigo Jones had already brought classicism to England. This is the Queen's house in London, and that, as you will see, this is as early as 1638. So that in fact classicism in a pure form had already begun to travel to England and came with Palladio. You have in Ireland, you have an expression of it. It's somewhat later. This is the original here, 1739. But here you can see a perfect Palladian building. And that what we have here now is we have an architect operating to, if you like, to a gentleman. The gentleman is his house. He's well educated in architecture. He's not going to present this as though a pretense that something he knows about. He does know about it. He will have been on the grand tour himself. He will have studied all of these as original documents. He will know the grammar, but he won't be an architect in terms of being able to use it. I mean, you can type, but that doesn't mean you're going to write a novel. So that in fact what he could do was type, and he had ideas here too. Could somebody translate these ideas for him? So you have then again Burlington. Burlington is an extraordinary man. Burlington is a wealthy English aristocrat of Irish origin, but he comes to London. He then takes very seriously to architecture. He never becomes an architect in his own right, but he now begins to promote the idea. He's now offering this as a promotion to all of the rest of the aristocracy, the level to which they should arise. He is a purist. He perhaps lacks imagination, but he doesn't lack skill, and that he produces a very fine building here in Chiswick House in London, and this becomes one of the models. I'll come back to this later. Now, I'm not going to labour through all of this. I mean, if I had plenty of time, I could. But what I'm talking about here now is that we have a development in Ireland. And I'm saying that the genesis of what becomes American democracy is to be found in European history. And that if we go back and look at what happens here, the first thing is, as early as 1606, we have Francis Bacon, the famous philosopher Bacon, who is now retained as an amanuensis to King James I, advising James that in fact something great has happened, plantation. It's a super answer. He says you can get rid of all the people you don't want, send them off out to the plantations and then tax them. And that you'll get the money back. You will also keep other people out by putting them in. He said, so it's a win-win-win situation for you. So James recommends plantations. But as early as 1909, then in 1609, what had happened by then was that because of what were known as the flight of the Earls in Ireland, the original Gaelic aristocracy left. Their lands were escheated. They came to the Crown, and there was 500,000 acres of land in the north of Ireland, which creates, if you like, the north of Ireland as such. These are where the rebel lords had been. They had flown. They had gone off to the continent. They were no longer welcome at home. They had effectively been defeated. Their lands were now distributed, and they were distributed in the form of plantations. Plantations were created, and adventurers' acts, as they said, were set up. In 1619, James actually established the first penal colony in Virginia. And that according to the record, he sent 100 dissolute persons to Virginia. And that this was great. Not only did you not have to support your people in your prisons, you could get rid of everybody who disagreed with you by sending them off to a colony. And that in fact, United States remained a penal colony until independence. So what we have then, we have Charles I then comes to the throne. By this stage, he promises the Irish Catholic lords that they will receive fair treatment, which they haven't been receiving up to now. They've been largely seen as being lands that can be taken for the benefit of Britain. That he promises them what are called the graces. He reneges on that. He sends Stafford to Ireland, Wentworth to Ireland. Wentworth has in fact, a totally abusive administration. He largely closes in on seeking to deprive all of the Catholic families of their lands, and that when in fact it suits Parliament, who are now falling out with Charles, they will ultimately behead him, but that they are going to war with him first, and that they are falling out with him, and that in the process they now unite with the Irish Parliament, which is largely Catholic, and that together they manage to have Wentworth impeached. And because Charles, A, he's a weak character, but B, it also suits him, he decides to have him, not to reprieve him and to allow him to be executed. And even though they fail to make their legal case against Wentworth, they still decide to execute him anyway, so that they behead him. And that as a result of that, everybody breathes a sigh of relief. The first thing that happens in the Irish Parliament is that they decide that they better now have a series of clarifications that will prevent the Parliament in England, which is becoming more and more an independent Puritan Parliament, to try and establish that they have no right to legislate for Ireland. Now, this is the parallel with America, that in fact the right to legislate for a colony. Ireland is not a colony. Ireland is a coordinate kingdom, but the same principles apply. Whereas the United Kingdom Parliament the United Kingdom hasn't come into existence yet, but the English Parliament will in fact assert that it has the right to legislate for Ireland. Whereas in fact, in order to preempt that, the Catholic Parliament in 1641, they put a series of what are called the questions to the justices. This leads to Darcy's questions and Darcy's argument. Darcy was a lawyer, a very sophisticated lawyer, who had fought against, if you like, the Parliament in London in terms of the cheating of Irish lands. He was qualified in England and he would have been a high-ranking lawyer in England. But that nonetheless, Darcy was very much on the Catholic side. He was a Catholic lawyer, himself and another lawyer called Martin. They posed the questions to the justices. The justices kind of were a little bit iffy about the prerogative because they felt that it might be used against them, but they did come down to a conclusion that Ireland was an independent kingdom and that the United Kingdom Parliament, the English Parliament, did not have the power to legislate for Ireland. Now, what happened in the meantime then was a revolution of 1641, a rebellion of 1641, where in fact the Catholic population of the north had had as much as they could take. They now reacted, and that they rebelled against the extant forces up there, and that there was a large massacre of Protestants in the north. This sent a sort of a shudder right through the whole of the establishment, because by now Charles was at war with his Parliament in England. He was at war with the Scots, so that in fact Charles was at war with everybody. Ireland then decided, that the Catholic Parliament decided, that it was no longer safe to rely on the English Parliament, despite the fact that the judges had indicated that the English Parliament couldn't legislate for them. So they decided that they would abandon that Parliament and that they would create a new Parliament of their own. And therefore the Catholics all left the Parliament. They withdrew to Kilkenny, and that they formed an assembly with the church leaders in Kilkenny, and that they brought together nearly all of the disparate elements within the country, and that they unified them into what was called the Catholic Confederation. The only common denominator was Catholic. Now it was bound to fail. All other interests were at odds with each other. Property interests and cultural interests were all at odds, but that they would contain them within the greater one of seeking independent Catholic Ireland. So they declared a parliament, they created a parliament, and Darcy wrote the famous Constitution. And they made the declaration and wrote the Constitution. And that Constitution is the first constitution in the Western world which has a separation of powers. It actually separates the power of the executive from the power of the legislature. There was a Supreme Council and there was an Assembly. The Assembly reserved complete power, and that it merely allocated that power to the Council, to the Supreme Council, while Parliament was not in session. But that when Parliament came back into session, Parliament could reverse anything, and that nothing was absolute until Parliament had passed it. So the executive had absolutely no power, but the executive formed part of the Parliament itself. So that in fact, and it worked on the basis of the existing franchise, and that franchise also authorised them to govern, and they governed. In fact, 3/4 of the country was governed, because at that stage the Parliament in London was so busy closing in on its own interests and protecting itself and in war against the king, it didn't really have time to deal with Ireland. Then they got an offer they couldn't refuse, and the offer they couldn't refuse came from a group of Presbyterians in London who actually did a calculation and calculated that when Britain defeated Ireland in terms of this interest, and when the Parliament managed to get things back in order, there would be 2.5 million acres of Catholic land would be escheated to the Crown. In other words, they would be attainted, so it would come to the Crown. Therefore, the Crown would gain 2.5 million acres, and they made an offer of £1 million they would pay up front in order to allow Parliament to send an army to Ireland, and that when that army was successful, they would get the 2.5 million acres. So 2.5 million acres would come in return for £1 million. And that was a deal Parliament couldn't sniff at. So Parliament agreed to it and passed what was called the Adventurers Act of 1842. Now, they were on the point of breaking with the king at that stage, but they managed to lean on the king for the king to approve that act, even though they were already making acts without the authority of the king. So the king completely, if you like, stuck a knife in the back of Ireland with regard to that, and that at that stage then, they pretty much, the Confederation knew that it was on its own. It set up, if you like, a military, it was badly organised. It merged together the old Irish Gaelic together with the if you like, the Irish Catholics, the Old English as they were called, the Norman English, and that they all fought a campaign over a period of up to 1850s, over a period of 8 years. They fought a campaign, progressively losing. In the meantime, Cromwell was gaining ground in Ireland, and gaining ground in England, and eventually Cromwell managed in 1649 to dispose of the king, to take supreme control himself, and now he had time to turn his attention to Ireland, so that he put all his forces together, came to Ireland, and then devastated Ireland in terms of, to such an extent that in fact it was going to be at least 200 years before Ireland would recover from that particular extermination. Now, people will say Cromwell was very cruel. He was brutal, he was cruel, but that his objective, he was the agent of God, of course, in his own eyes, but that he was there to visit punishment on the Irish, and that he wanted to get rid of them as a problem. So what he couldn't transport, he would plant. And that he planted what were called the adventurers. Anybody who joined his armies and came would get land in return. They all came, they got land. You had then the Cromwellian settlement of 1652, and that effectively took all of the land, of 3/4 of Ireland was taken, of the useful land of 3/4 of the country, and that Protestant Cromwellians were settled in that land. When Charles came back in the Restoration came about, as you know, and that Parliament then, if you like, put Charles back on condition of good behaviour, and that he effectively had to limit his prerogative down to what they told him it was. So he wasn't a king in any real sense. It was now a parliamentary monarchy, I suppose you could call it. But that when he came back, then he was Charles was to he then recreated an Irish Parliament. At this stage, the Parliament in Kilkenny had passed. He recreated an Irish Parliament, and what was known as the Restoration Parliament sat in Dublin in 1660. Now, again, that's just a map of Ireland showing the extent to which the different interests prevailed during the Confederate Wars. That would have been an indication of what a Parliament building was. That's the House of Commons, and that's the trial of Wentworth. That is when Wentworth was executed by Parliament and disposed of. But I've put it in there to show you generally the way in which a Parliament building would have been perceived by the people at that time. That's the way it worked. If we go back to Kilkenny, I just want to comment on the fact that the building sometimes also will express the ideas that lie behind, if you like, the constitutional position. There are two possible sites in Kilkenny. If you remember, Cromwell sent a man called Axtell to be the governor of Kilkenny. Axtell occupied one of Shee's houses, and that took over the other one, which had been the Parliament building. Now, it's never been absolutely decided or determined as to which was which, but I think it's almost certain that the one that's shown in blue there is in fact the house that was the Parliament House. That was always recognised as the Parliament House, and that it survived until the 1850s, and that in the 1850s it was demolished. But fortunately, before it was demolished, in fact, to create a marketplace in the town, but that before it was demolished, fortunately, photographs were taken. And that these are the photographs, sorry, 1862, it was demolished. These were the photographs that were taken in 1862 and were glass slides which were packed away into the Kilkenny Kilkenny antiquaries, and that they passed over ultimately to the Royal Antiquary Society of Ireland, and that we found these slides in their archives, which actually show us the buildings, the Parliament buildings, before they were demolished. Now, we also did research at the moment in the courthouse. That's the courthouse in Kilkenny, and the existing courthouse in Kilkenny, built in the 1850s. And that we have discovered there from archaeological research that there are certain parts of the cellars of the courthouse, which are now the cells actually where prisoners were held in it, that those in fact are the only residual elements of the building of the original house. Rather than therefore spend too much time on it, that is merely referred to as Confederation Hall, and that was in 1888, isn't it? 1887, 1888, that plaque was erected there by the Mayor of Kilkenny commemorating the site. And here we are back again to this idea of the importance of place, the enduring of time. I'm back to Bergson. Bergson has layered into this that was the Confederation of Kilkenny was located here. This happened at this point, something that was important, a turning point in relation to almost the embryos of what would later be what will be washed across the Atlantic occurs here. Darcy, unfortunately, wasn't honoured in his time. He was a Catholic, his lands were taken, he was jailed for a period of time, and eventually he died, and that he's buried here in Kilconnell Abbey in Galway, and that his epitaph is an interesting one. It is Hic miseria patria sola columna ieset. Here, sad country, lies your only support. And that he's buried now in 1668. This is after the Restoration. This is when things should have improved. They haven't. In other words, they have been let down again. Not only let down by Charles, but now let down by his son. And that in fact there's a certain sadness incorporated within that idea. And the place itself is a monument to him. And that what's printed on the side of it there, I'm not going to read it now, but just is an abstract from the Constitution of the Confederate Government, which in fact will show you that the separation of powers is first identified in this location. If we move on to what happens then in the after this, by 1898, what has happened is that because British trade keeps on taking everything for itself that works, it does it by excluding the colonies, by saying the colonies can't do what damages English trade. So that in fact, in Ireland, the English are not interested in the linen trade. So that in fact, they allow the linen trade to develop in Ireland, and therefore Ireland becomes the great source within the empire of linen. And that the Irish economy depends to a very large extent on linen and its export. This is accepted at this point, and then the English bring in an act to the effect that all free trade is going to be suspended. There's no free trade, that in fact everything must be traded through English ports, and that England will control all exports from the colonies back to the colonies. And this is in order to limit the movement of goods, and we're now moving into an economy that's going to be more valued by reference to goods. So what we have then is, we have a man called William Molyneux, who is also a lawyer, and that a Protestant lawyer this time, and he finds a copy of Darcy's argument, a lot of which has been destroyed during the Cromwellian period. But he finds one, and that he effectively restructures that argument, and once again he attacks the English crown on the basis that England has no right to legislate for Ireland. And that by 1703, the Irish Parliament established what have been referred to earlier as the penal laws. The purpose of the penal laws effectively is threefold. It is to deprive the Catholics of any military possibility, therefore they're not allowed to carry arms or associate in any way with military association. They're not effectively allowed to hold land, and therefore their ability to hold leases are of very, very limited value, and they're not allowed to educate. and that their property will be divided not according to primogeniture, which keeps property intact, but will be divided, as they say, per stirpes, or among all of the sons, as it proceeds through for Catholics. So that in fact you then get, penal laws never have as much effect as they were intended to have. Protestant reign settles down, it becomes established. You have the Battle of the Boyne. You have a short period when you have what's called the Patriot Parliament. When James II comes back, he gets driven out by his son-in-law William, who is invited into England to take over from him. When James is driven out, James comes back to Ireland. He assembles an army in Ireland, and he meets William's army at the Battle of the Boyne. And you have the famous decisive Battle of the Boyne that establishes the British Parliament as supreme for all time and destroys any idea of significant monarchical succession. You then have, after that, you have the Act of Settlement of 1705, which effectively settles the crown on the nearest blood relation of the last Protestant daughter of James, which is Sophia the Electress of Hanover, and that her son George, eventually, George of Hanover, he acquires the British crown through title as being the closest Protestant heir that can be legitimised back through the Stuarts. And you see the importance of legitimacy in relation to these things. It's very important to keep the interests of land ownership intact, because wealth and land are still the same thing. Now what you have then is you have in 1717, an unusual thing happens. You have this tension between the English Parliament, who say they can legislate for Ireland, and Ireland, which says they can't. And you have a famous case, I'll just mention it quickly, it's Annesley and Sherlock. And in Annesley and Sherlock, what happens is that Annesley has property, goes to the court and gets an order from the court for possession. Sherlock appeals to the Irish House of Lords, and the Irish House of Lords say that Annesley, they override the court and they say that Sherlock has possession. She goes to take possession, and then Annesley appeals to the House of Lords in England. And the House of Lords of England then decides that Annesley has possession, and that they instruct the sheriff, both parties, the Irish House of Lords and the English House of Lords, instruct the sheriff to put alternative parties into possession. The sheriff chooses to go with the Irish House of Lords, and that the Irish courts, on the instructions of the English House of Lords, imprison him. So in those circumstances, the Irish courts then imprison the judges. So that everybody's in prison at this stage, and the two House of Lords are looking at each other. So at that stage, England backs down. Now, there's an exact parallel to what's going to happen in America here. The English step down, but what they do is they bring in a declaratory act the following year of 1719 to say that they have right to legislate for Ireland. So what they do is they kill the current controversy by withdrawing, and then make a statement that they could have done it anyway. So that in fact there's now nothing to fight over. So the declaratory act is protested against, but it sails through, it gets there. Now, various things happen. I don't have time to deal with them now, but that so that then, if you like, I'm just introducing it here, the Declaratory Act in Ireland of 1719, and that is the Declaratory Act in 1766. But remember, as I said earlier, in 1765, after the Stamp Act is withdrawn, because of the rebellion in America, or the threatened rebellion in America, Parliament does exactly the same thing. The English Parliament does exactly the same thing. It says, okay, look, game's off. And then the next thing it does, it sends around a declaratory act that says we could have done it anyway. And in future, remember, we can do it. So you get and all that happens here, if you read the two, is they've really just changed the titles. It is the same act repeated again, and it's actually the same solution. Coming back to I'll just skip over that, but coming back to the Irish Parliament, that the Irish Parliament buy a house called Chichester House. I'll go quickly through this because I'm sure I'm well beyond time. But I'll go quickly through that as to the way architects approach things, because I think this becomes important in the relationship that you're going to get in capital, and I think maybe Andrew will be dealing with this to a greater extent, but that the relationship that you're going to get between architects and how they tackle the problems, how they solve problems. And it's been the same way for all time. It hasn't changed. We're still trained the same way today as people were then. That when you find that this, in fact, is Chichester House, which is in College Green in Dublin. That was the preceding slide, showing you the sort of the location, the black building that's shown there with the curved fronts on it is the Irish Parliament House. And that you can see see the importance of the location. That's Trinity College that's on the above it there. But that the original house that was there, I won't spend time on the history of it, but if you analyse the functions, the way in which Parliament adapted that house, which was built as a hospital for soldiers, but that it finishes up by having you enter on a central access there, and that you have effectively a court of request. You have a location where people can come to ask for things. They can come on bended knee, so to speak, and request. You come on in there, and then you have the Commons and you have the Lords. You have a bicameral Parliament, and they're treated equally. They're given equal status in terms of where they're located within the plan and how they're expressed within the building. You have committee rooms then, which are extremely important, because committees are where these. We have now, of course, learnt that you can't, like the first slide I show you, you can't just have a big discussion in an open parliament with hundreds of people present and come to a conclusion. You have to break down into committees so that they have learnt to proceed by way of committees. So committees must be available to both houses, so to speak. But they don't communicate that much between them. They can go from one another's committee room, but they haven't yet created this idea of a central conference area. You then have a whole series of functions there. But what you're seeing is the distinction in the bicameral distinction between the Commons on the one side and the Lords on the other. Now, the Commons at this stage are merely the landowners. They're a very limited franchise. They're wealthy people who, in fact, can have influence in court. You have the Lords, who in fact are the aristocrats, where power is vested. These are the council that collected around the Norman king, and discussed the next phase of battle with him. Whereas on this side here, the Commons are merely sent him. They're the also-rans. And it's only when funds are required that they must enter, because Magna Carta has guaranteed that, in fact, the peasantry will not be fixed with taxes unless they have consented to it. So this is where the peasantry consent to pay tax, and this is where all the decisions are taken. And this is the Hall of Requests, that if, in fact, you want to request something, you are holding something in one hand. What you're holding in one hand is, if you like, the funding. You're saying, right, we'll fund you, but. And then on the other side, the Lords, I'm doing it backwards, the Lords on the other side, they are the Crown, effectively. They're saying, okay, well, we'll grant you A, B, and C, and the understanding is that you will give us funds. So the Crown only calls Parliament when it's stuck for funds, because it'll be embarrassed by being asked a whole lot of questions it doesn't want to answer and having to give things it doesn't want to give. So that in fact you have this, but nonetheless you've already got the shape of a Parliament building beginning to occur there. Now in 1829 we have an extraordinary man, Edward Lovett Pearce, who I would say is the first great Palladian in the English-speaking world. He precedes Burlington, he succeeds Jones. Jones, in a sense, wasn't really a Palladian. He was a man who brought classicism, but he wasn't a Palladian in the pure sense of the term. Pearce is an extraordinary man. Not much is known about him. He was a military man. He was a military surveyor, and that he was also an astute politician, and that he came to power. He became a member of Parliament himself in due course, but he was an amanuensis to a very powerful man called Connolly. Ireland was at that stage in the transition between ownership to land and, if you like, management of money. Connolly was a very clever money manager. He wasn't a man of aristocratic descent, and that he had come to be, if you like, a manager on behalf of Parliament. And what he used to do was, he was called an undertaker, and that's what they called them. And the undertakers used to strike a deal with the Crown on the one side and say to the Crown, this is what you want. We'll get it for you, provided you give us. And the give us was, you give us all your patronage. So that political patronage was given to a person like Connolly. So Connolly could in fact hand out all of the goods that were handed out by the Crown every year. He could decide who got them. And in return for that, he would guarantee to deliver Parliament. He would deliver the funding, the supplies required from Parliament. So we would call it a highly corrupt system, but it was the system. And that everybody, it's perhaps not fair to call people who engage in a system which is accepted by everybody, afterwards you can call them corrupt. I don't think it's necessarily right to call them corrupt at the time. And what Pearce does, Pearce designs this extraordinary building, this great Palladian building. Nothing has ever been quite seen like it. Now, Eddie McParland, who is one of the leading experts in this area, and he was sort of one of my advisors when I was doing my thesis too, but he has analysed this for the last 50 years, and that he hasn't come up really with where Pearce conceived this idea. There are various suggestions as to how it came about, but he did this extraordinary axis here. And that in the axis he does two things here. First of all, he comes in here, he comes through the Hall of Requests, he puts the House of Commons here under a dome. Now, a dome was very important in terms of classical architecture. A dome, in fact, was a Roman invention in reality, and that it was an arch which was spun through 360 degrees. So that, in fact, if in fact you can span a very large section of space, and everything must be in compression. Now, compression means that it must be pressing together. All of the grain of the stone must press together. Stone has no tensile resistance. If you span a stone over something so that its grain is running across the opening and then put a weight on it, it will just break. It will crack. Whereas if in fact you can put any weight you like on top of a stone and that, well, until it comes to its crushing strength, which is immense, it won't crush. So that as long as you can resolve all forces in compression, you can in fact span enormous spans. And the Pantheon is a perfect example in Rome, where it's done in a coarse kind of Roman concrete, but that it is all based on compression. If in fact any tension were to come into that structure, it would collapse. There is no tension in it. So a dome is an arch which resolves all forces, that everything is pressing downwards in an arch. That's its genius. And then spin that through a circle, and you've got a dome. So you can build domes over very large spaces, and because it's based on an arch, you can also leave a very big hole in the top without interfering with the compression, because the arch itself, the circle that closes the eye at the top, will go into compression itself. So everything in an arch goes into in a dome goes into compression. So we must remember that all structure at this stage, steel didn't exist. Iron was just barely there, and iron anyway itself has very limited tensile strength. Iron is only increased its tensile strength when steel is added through the Bessemer process, and that isn't developed until later. So that what we have then is, we notice here, is that the House of Lords is subordinate. It's just a kind of a side chamber of this. It has its own entrance here, all right, but nothing like the central ceremonial entrance of the House of Commons. So here we have the dominance, an unusual dominance, the dominance of the Commons, that in fact those who represent the people, or will represent the people, because as the franchise grows, the people will become a real demos. They won't be the narrow group that are represented in this Parliament, but that the structure will accommodate that. So that if we go on from that, then what happens is that when we come to Irish independence, which runs parallel with it runs parallel with the idea of American independence, and that as America then breaks loose, America decides to go by the revolutionary route. It's not going to bargain. It's not going to argue anymore. It's had enough. It's going to actually go to war. Now, it can do so because it's far enough away. It's very difficult to provision. It's very difficult to manage. It has many escape routes and so on. Ireland doesn't have this option. It's too much contained. It's too close, and it's too dangerous, because France can come in and France can spring on to England from Ireland. America doesn't have the same problems. So Ireland never gets the option of taking that route. But what you have is the Patriot Party comes into existence in 1760. That develops parallel to the American Revolution. That develops in Ireland. And the British Parliament, George III is feeling sore at this stage. He knows what can happen. He doesn't have the resources. He allows the idea of armed militia. Armed militia are dangerous because in fact they can turn on you, and that's exactly what happens. In the Irish Parliament, they turn on him. And in 1783, eventually, we get the Renunciation Act, and this is running very parallel to the American development of the American independence, 1775, and then the American Constitution. These are developing at the same time. So you have Ireland now moves that. But what happens, interestingly enough, which is almost a contradiction, is the House of Lords now demand to be raised in status. So they bring James Gandon in, who was in fact, again, one of the masters to Hoban. But they bring Gandon in, and they get Gandon to do what's called the House of Lords portico. The city, in the meantime, has moved in this direction to the right, and that now you have great plazas on this side here, and they do a Corinthian entrance to the House of Lords here. The whole, Pearse originally did this again in Scamozzi's Ionic, again the maternal instinct of the Parliament, but the Lords know, the Lords are going to be kind of maidenly and so on there. They're going to be magnificent on that stage. However, that's not altogether the correct explanation, because Gandon gives an explanation himself for why he used Corinthian. Because the ground falls. He couldn't manage to hold the proportions of the Ionic without having a large stylobate, which he didn't want, he couldn't afford. He hadn't the space for it. So as a result, he had to find an order that could be taller, so it could make up for the difference in the fall of the ground. And that the Corinthian permitted him to do this, because the Corinthian is 9 times the diameter of the column, whereas the Ionic is 7. So that extra space allowed him. And that he finishes up then by adding this sort of very elegant area, which brings you into the House of Lords through their own vestibule. And then that's a man called Park completes it. And then you get this idea. You still have the main entrance going in here, the dome over the centre here, and the House of Lords coming in from this stage, this side, but now conveniently turning its back completely on the, if you like, the public interest coming from this side here. So what we have here is the House of Lords. The House of Lords has, curiously, Gandon did that, I'll jump over that. Those are just indications. That would indicate to you, this here is the front of the Parliament building here. And this would be again, the Scamozzi's Ionic front, done by Pearse originally, deemed to be one of the finest Palladian buildings in Europe, and the first. And that this here is Gandon's Ionic porch coming into the side. And you can see how much taller it is than the Scamozzi on this side here. So the House of Lords curiously survived. That's it there on the left-hand side. And that it's retained to this present day by the bank as a sort of a museum piece. Anybody can visit it. And that is pretty much exactly as it was. And that you have then Pearse's design. Not only did he deal with the exterior of the building, but he had an extraordinarily elegant interior in which he brought light in. And you're seeing here, anything in a quality that you will get in Rome will be... and then that just gives you an indication of what the Parliament House was when it was functioning. I just want to mention this very quickly because coming on to the capital, William Kent, who was Burlington's, if you like, amanuensis architect at that stage, also did a proposal for the House of Commons and Lords for the Parliament buildings in England, and that this was the plan he came up with. Now it wasn't built; it was never built. But that if you look at what he's doing here is he's coming straight in here. He's coming into his entrance hall here, into the House of Lords and into the House of Commons and into a conference chamber. Now there's a difference to be distinguished here. This is conference, so now we have this idea of there being a conferring between Lords and Commons, but we have this now on a single axis with a public entrance coming in here, and we have his dome located, his dome located, or his tower is located over the conference. Okay, I'm not going to. Dealt with those right now. I can just come very quickly to the capital and taking those models in relation to the capital. And if we take the at least I think this is a reconstruction of the Thornton plan here, and I'm commenting on this only just with regard to the general form of it. But what you see, interestingly enough, here is that you're now coming into the centre here, into the rotunda, and the rotunda is going through into the conference room at the back here. And then you're going into the Senate and the representatives on either side. And that this is originally Thornton's plan. Now, as I say, Thornton was an amateur architect to the extent that he was an educated man who had architectural ideas and could express architectural concepts. But he needed somebody to execute them, and that, of course, it was Hallett and Hoban who were appointed to execute. If we go on from there then to La Trobe's plan, as it develops, what we can see is that more or less the same thing is happening, but there's something subtle changed here. First of all, the dome is now over the Hall of the People. It's no longer a hall of requests. This is a fundamental change, because we're now recognizing the people as having an existence. Up to now, the people have been subordinate. They have been allowed to put requests, but they have had no essential rights. Here, for the first time in Washington's concept of a capital, the Temple of Jupiter at the very heart of the Third Great Republic is going to be what? The people. And that from the Hall of the People, you have three possibilities. You've got the Senate representatives, and you've got the, well, in this particular case, it's the library, but I think this becomes the conference. What we have then is this is the La Trobe perception of it. Again, slightly ungainly in terms of the dome. The dome does lack an elegance there, and that one gets the impression that the dome is more important to the interior of the building than it is as an architectural feature within the building. And then I think we get, to me, is the masterpiece, which is Walter's, if you like, taking of a building that was, it had all of the embryos of success within it, and he makes it into a striking success. And he does so effectively by continuing its logic And its logic again was the whole of the people in the centre, that you would have the Senate and the representatives on either side, and that what was originally the Senate and the House of Representatives can now become proper public areas that introduce them, giving them sort of a dignity and giving the people a separation from them. And then you have, if you like, the working supports surrounding that. I think originally you had the Supreme Court there as well. But that in this you get a synthesis, which the original building had the genesis of a synthesis because it was grammatically constructed in accordance with correct lines. That his dome, he then goes for a dome, and at that time the dome in St. Petersburg, the St. Isaac's in Petersburg, is being developed. Cast iron has now become a possibility, but remember, cast iron has no tensile strength, and therefore it must be resolved in compression. So what St. Isaac's does is it uses cast iron to create a vast arch, all resolved in compression and all brought down because cast iron can take far greater stresses, compressive stresses, than stone can. So that in fact now you can extend it to such a level that in fact it won't crush itself. If that were done in stone, there's a possibility of it crushing itself. It can no longer, the stone itself can no longer withstand the compressive strength. That brings us on then to a comparator of the dome, and again I think this is from Pam Scott's book here, that an illustration of the dome and how it's actually achieved. The structure of the dome is achieved. The dome of course becomes a mighty symbol in terms of defining the site. And I thought that was particularly interesting in Pam's lecture earlier this morning. Something I was saying to her, it never occurred to me, was the contextualizing of this building. This building, if you look at the original watercolours, as indeed if you look at the White House, it has a gaunt quality of being sort of in a wasteland, whereas in fact that wasteland then takes away all of the character of the building, but having developed the landscape around it and shaped it. And this idea of landscape actually being a shape, particularly the romantic idea of a soft landscape as opposed to a formal landscape, but with enough formality in it to make it man-made, but at the same time to allow nature to express itself in terms of man's framework, that you get a context for this, that even at this stage there's a kind of a certain openness and abandonedness to the surrounding areas, that in fact as the landscape matures. And this idea, and I suppose it must be something very frustrating to people who create large landscapes, that they probably never live to see them, but that they can only see them in their imagination, but that there is an enormous legacy owed to them. And that of course then presenting the capital, given this idea, and I'm back again just to closing down on the basis of Washington's concept that he would use architecture as well as language in order to define the world's third great capital, as a republican capital, that you had you had Greece, you had Rome, and you would now have Washington. And these will be the three major stages, and that as the history of the world faded away, and if we come back to this idea of endured time, back to Bergson's idea of endured time, what are the significant layers that have been laid in? There are many layers of minimal significance. There are significant layers. Mozart's period of composing is a significant layer in the human experience in general. The idea of Temple of Zeus in Athens is in fact a critical slice through, section through, if you like, time, the time of our culture. Rome and the development of the capital is significant. They're now gone. They've now gone into the past, but they're not lost. They're still there. They're endured in the present. And now you have Washington. And that I think Jefferson's perception was that Washington in the end, when in fact these layers were examined, putting it at its most teleological, that in fact when these layers were examined at the end of a civilization, these would be the markers. And that these were the influences which created the markers, many of them unlikely. And this idea, again, that Bergson had, that all possibilities are there until they happen. But once they happen, you can't reverse them. And this is what history is. History is the solidifying of possibilities and turning them into facts. Architecture is, as I say, a silent language that speaks. Landscaping is, I think from today's lecture, is also a silent language that speaks. And that in fact all of its symbolism is in us, whether we know it or not, it's there. These were the factors that formed these decisions. These were the statements that were made. And out of what was a very weak possibility, the possibility of a republic, amongst 13 slightly, if you like, less than interested states in terms of creating any very great world outcome. That in fact these men, the founders of this state, managed to create, using these devices, admittedly they were the right men at the right time. The times were right for them, the times were right for what they did. And that in fact what they did was, again, I think it was, they took that wave that came across and all that was in it, the Europe that came to the Allegheny, and what they did was they then recreated that from America back into being the United States. And that this is a process, and I think Bergson helps us in this process. I'm not going to delay on it, that's just showing you the Houses of Parliament were done afterwards. The Irish Leinster House in Dublin, they all follow the same pattern. I'm way beyond time, I'm not going to delay on it. That's Stormont, the Parliament in Northern Ireland. You can see that they all follow on, and that ultimately they all identify the same thing. They identify this idea of the whole of the people being at the centre. So as the franchise increases, as the democracy enlarges, the meaning of these parliaments, which was hidden up to now, becomes relevant. The course of history, what again Bergson had called l'allure universelle. In other words, the same way that water finds its way to the sea, that in fact there was a process that was going to find its way to independence. It was going to find its way to equality. It was going to find its way to this key that Aristotle said at the beginning, all men are born to be equal, all men are born to be citizens. And that this was going to achieve that. It was going to widen the idea of all men are citizens. So that in fact, that's where we come to. And I just close by pointing out, if we go back to the Parliament building in Dublin, which is now the Bank, because the Parliament, as you know, was united with England in the year 1800, and that the development of the Irish state is a separate story, but that it is a place of assembly. And that if we go back to Alberti has this idea of the centre of a city is where you place your Senate, and that all come to the Senate, and that the spirit of the people is vested in the Senate. And that when something great happens amongst a people, it will be reflected in and at and around the Senate. And that if you take the Parliament buildings in Dublin, and that if you look in 1922, when the treaty, which in fact gave Ireland its independence, is announced, you can see what happens at the Parliament building. There is a general magnetism that draws people towards it. When Obama came to Dublin, again, a representative, a man who also claims Irish ancestry, that in fact, or he has Irish ancestry, I should say, more than claims it. But he comes to Dublin, and again, the people turn out. When Kennedy came, the same thing happened. So that in fact, this becomes a sacred place. And I close, as I opened, with Bergson's idea of endured time, le temps duré, that in fact endured in this place, it's a sacred place, as endured in the Capitol, as endured in the Temple of Zeus, and as endured now in the Capitol here in Washington. There is a spirit of a people. It is significant. It is important. It far outstrips the importance of flags, I think. In fact, it becomes a place, because endured in that place, and according to Bergson's theory of time, time has already invested something in that place, and it can never lose it. So thank you very much.